In the early hours of an unremarkable morning, during the year 1769, a child named Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the island of Corsica. The island itself, located in the Mediterranean Sea, was known more for its uneven terrain than for exciting events, and this geographical detail would later be used by historians to explain, in lengthy writings, the formation of Napoleon's character. Many pages have been filled describing the mild climate, the olive trees, and the political situation of the island, none of which seem particularly urgent today, yet they are repeatedly mentioned in academic texts. Napoleon's early education proceeded in a similarly ordinary manner. He learned arithmetic, geography, and French, a language he spoke with a noticeable accent that scholars continue to discuss at unnecessary length. At the military school in Brienne, he read books, walked across courtyards at regular intervals, and practiced the same drills day after day. According to various records, he was quiet, somewhat isolated, and spent considerable time thinking about matters that would later appear in even more numerous historical documents. By the late 1790s, Napoleon began to rise in the French military. This rise is often described as rapid, although it occurred over multiple years and through a series of administrative promotions, reorganized regiments, and committee approvals. His strategies, while called brilliant, involved long hours analyzing maps, calculating distances, and planning troop movements, all tasks that appear more tedious when described without dramatic embellishment. The scene most often associated with Napoleon, him standing at the center of a battlefield in his navy coat and bicorn hat, was usually preceded by several hours of logistical preparation. Soldiers marched into place. Cannons were positioned with precise measurements. Smoke drifted slowly over the field due to wind patterns documented by officers. The sun, when it occasionally broke through the clouds, did so at its own natural pace, without any intention to highlight Napoleon's face. During battles such as Austerlitz, the lines of infantry moved according to rehearsed instructions. Flags fluttered simply because the air moved around them. The muddy terrain, often emphasized in paintings, resulted from ordinary rainfall that had occurred earlier that week. Napoleon often stood quietly, observing these developments with an expression that historians debate heavily, even though he likely showed only mild concentration. As the years progressed, his empire expanded through treaties, supply deliveries, administrative reforms, and numerous meetings conducted in rooms with long tables and many documents. Though popular accounts speak of ambition and destiny, most of his time involved reviewing reports, signing papers, and issuing orders that required further paperwork. Finally, after several campaigns and an accumulation of logistical setbacks, Napoleon's fortunes declined. He was exiled, returned briefly, and then exiled again. On the island of St. Helena, he lived in a relatively quiet manner, recording thoughts, discussing minor details with visitors, and walking slowly around the property. His death in 1821 concluded a life that has since generated thousands of books, many of which describe events in a tone much more dramatic than the day-to-day activities likely were. Thus, the story of Napoleon, often told with cannons, storms, and dazzling light, is, in its slow and factual form, a long sequence of decisions, marches, letters, and weather conditions, matters that, while historically important, unfold with a calm regularity that may gently lead any listener towards sleep. In the gentle light of early Corsican mornings, the island seemed almost suspended in time. Olive trees stretched their limbs lazily toward the horizon, their leaves barely rustling in the occasional breeze. The sky, painted in shades of pale peach and soft gray, hinted at the coming day with a quiet deliberation. It was in this calm, almost unhurried environment that a boy named Napoleon Bonaparte entered the world in 1769. The birth itself was not accompanied by loud celebrations or extraordinary portents. Midwives attended to the child in the standard, methodical manner. His parents, Carlo and Letizia, noted the normality of the event, recording the date and time in a ledger with careful attention to detail. Later historians, seeking to dramatize beginnings of great men, would describe it as the birth of destiny. But in reality, it passed as any other birth might. A baby arrived, cried softly, and was fed in the slow rhythm of early life. Napoleon's earliest days unfolded in the quiet spaces of the family home. He learned to sit, to walk, and to speak, all at a pace that seemed measured and deliberate. Corsica itself, with its rolling hills, rocky cliffs, and meandering streams, provided a backdrop of constant but gentle motion. Each season drifted imperceptibly into the next. Rain fell, sometimes heavily, sometimes in fine mist, softening the ground and leaving behind faint, wet scents. The boy would watch this slow transformation of land and sky with an attention that foreshadowed the careful observation he would bring to the art of war many years later. By the age of 7, Napoleon was enrolled in a local school where lessons were taught with the quiet rigor of classical education. Arithmetic occupied most mornings, and geography filled the afternoons with maps and globes. He traced coastlines and measured distances with meticulous fingers, drawing lines that, in the future, would form the contours of his strategic mind. These early exercises, though seemingly mundane, were recorded in countless letters and diaries by teachers, who noted, with almost sleepy fascination, that the boy's focus did not waver. The move to the military school at Brienne, France, marked a subtle shift in his life, though still without dramatic fanfare. Wooden floors echoed beneath the careful steps of cadets. Corridors stretched long and quiet, their windows occasionally catching the soft glow of late afternoon sun. Napoleon walked these hallways often, sometimes alone, sometimes among classmates, always observing. In the classrooms, the lessons continued in a slow, steady rhythm. Latin declensions, mathematics, history of distant lands, everything passed in unhurried succession. Napoleon's demeanor was described as quiet and serious. He spoke only when necessary, and his voice, when heard, was deliberate and soft. He practiced drills with methodical precision, repeating the same movements hundreds of times until they became second nature. His instructors, noting this, began to write about his potential, emphasizing that he possessed an extraordinary capacity for concentration and a patience unusual for someone so young. Yet none of these observations suggested imminent fame. They suggested diligence and routine, and in their slow, painstaking detail, they reflected the overarching pace of his early life. The political situation of Europe during Napoleon's youth added layers of slow complexity to his environment. France itself was undergoing reforms, debates, and administrative reorganizations that stretched on over years. Wars were planned and postponed, treaties negotiated and renegotiated. The reports and correspondence from various military and governmental offices trickled slowly across the continent, arriving in stages that often left local commanders waiting for days or weeks before action could be taken. Napoleon, studying maps and letters, learned to interpret these slow-moving signals. He learned that the world's events unfolded not in sudden, dramatic bursts, but as a series of interlocking movements, often tedious and slow, yet building toward eventual consequence. By the time Napoleon was sent to the mainland for further education, the routine of life had already shaped him into a man accustomed to patience. Long walks through stone-paved streets, evenings spent reading by the dim light of lamps, and hours of reflection on maps and strategy had instilled in him a capacity for endurance that few could match. When he arrived at the École Militaire in Paris, the pace of the city contrasted with the measured rhythms of Brienne, yet even in the bustling capital, His days were filled with careful study and long, deliberate planning. Here, Napoleon encountered other cadets, each with their own ambitions, talents, and eccentricities. They spoke of battles, of heroes, of history, often with voices raised in excitement. Yet Napoleon remained a quiet observer. He listened, he studied, he recorded observations, and slowly, in the unhurried manner of a painter shading a canvas with minute strokes, he began to construct a mental framework for understanding armies, campaigns, and the intricate ballet of nations. This slow accumulation of knowledge and patience would later be tested in ways that the island of Corsica could not have foreseen. For now, it sufficed to describe the long, measured days, the disciplined routines, the repetition of drills, the careful study of historical campaigns that had already occurred decades or centuries earlier. These studies, dull to some, were for Napoleon a form of meditation, allowing him to absorb lessons in strategy, leadership, and the human condition, though the lessons themselves unfolded gradually, over months and years. This is the first segment, 1,500 words. Part 1 will continue in this same slow, cinematic, hypnotic style, gradually covering Napoleon's early commissions in the French army, the Corsican political conflicts, and his gradual rise, his first campaigns and slow, careful strategies, everyday life of soldiers and commanders in the 1790s, detailed descriptions of minor events, letters, marches, and logistics. If you like, I can immediately continue with the next segment, slowly building toward the famous battlefields, all while keeping the sleepy, cinematic tone. As the years passed, Napoleon's place in the French army became a slow but steady progression. Unlike the dramatic accounts of sudden promotions and heroic leaps, the reality was a careful accumulation of paperwork, evaluations, and minor assignments. He received letters from superiors detailing administrative duties, troop rosters, and supply requests. Each morning, he would rise before dawn, walking along the quiet streets of Paris or the orderly courtyards of his barracks, observing the city as it stretched awake in the gentle gray light of early hours. The sound of distant church bells, the creaking of wagon wheels along stone streets, and the occasional bark of a dog punctuated these early mornings with a soft, repetitive rhythm that marked the passage of days more than any extraordinary event ever could. Napoleon's first experiences in command were similarly unremarkable in appearance, though meticulously noted in the annals of history. He oversaw small artillery units, inspected cannons, and wrote reports on their condition. Soldiers drilled under his watch, performing the same routines again and again, loading muskets, practicing formations, marching in circles across muddy fields. At times, smoke from test firings drifted lazily through the training ground, curling into soft, gray spirals that dissipated with the wind. Napoleon noted the alignment of cannons, the spacing of troops, the slope of the ground, details that seemed minor, yet historians would later interpret them as evidence of the strategic mind at work. Meanwhile, the world beyond the walls of the barracks moved in slow, bureaucratic patterns. Governments debated troop movements in meetings that stretched for hours, then days, with reports passed from one clerk to another. Supplies were delayed because wagons broke down or rivers flooded. Orders arrived weeks after they were written. Napoleon learned to wait, to anticipate, to measure every action against the slow, unfolding reality of logistics and communication. Even the wind became a factor, as it could alter the course of a cannonball or the direction of smoke across a battlefield. Each observation added to the methodical foundation upon which his future campaigns would be built. It was during these slow, measured years that Napoleon began to understand the rhythms of men as well as the rhythms of armies. He noted the fatigue in soldiers' faces after repeated drills, the small irritations that could build into discontent if not carefully managed, the subtle hierarchy that existed even among those of equal rank. He kept diaries, recorded minor incidents, and reflected on what might be learned from each small success or failure. Days passed in this quiet, repetitive manner, punctuated by occasional inspections, minor skirmishes with local groups of bandits or Corsican loyalists, and the routine paperwork of an officer rising through the ranks. By the time revolutionary upheaval began to sweep through France, Napoleon had already developed a patience that would serve him well. The revolution itself unfolded slowly in its early stages. Political debates filled the halls of assemblies, pamphlets circulated quietly from hand to hand, and rumors spread along streets lined with buildings that had long histories of their own. Napoleon observed these developments, noting them in a precise, detached manner. He paid attention not to the slogans or the fervor, but to the subtle shifts in power, the changing loyalties of local authorities, and the movement of regiments within the city. The first opportunities for actual military distinction came gradually, rather than with sudden fanfare. Napoleon was sent to garrison duty, a posting that required long days of supervision, inspection, and the slow march of paperwork. He calculated artillery positions, measured distances across plains, and instructed soldiers on precise formations. Each movement of a unit, each adjustment of a cannon, unfolded over hours, often in rain or cold that dampened both clothing and spirits. The meticulous repetition of drills, marching, and calculations may have seemed monotonous to outsiders. Yet these slow, careful actions formed the groundwork for strategies that would later be described as brilliant. In 1793, during the Siege of Toulon, Napoleon's life began to move in slightly faster circles. Yet even then, events unfolded with the measured pace of careful observation and repeated adjustment. He oversaw artillery placements, noting the slope of hills in the distance to enemy positions. Cannons were loaded and fired, smoke curling upward, dissipating slowly. Reports came in from officers, detailing minor skirmishes and the positioning of troops. Napoleon read each one carefully, calculating the best placement of forces not in sudden leaps, but in small, deliberate increments. The city, the harbor, the fortifications, they were all observed in quiet, careful detail. And when the city finally fell, the victory was recorded not in a single moment of drama, but as the cumulative result of slow planning, repeated adjustments, and careful observation. Even as Napoleon's fame began to grow, the everyday life of an officer remained full of repetition. Letters, inspections, logistical calculations, and minor skirmishes dominated his days. The landscape itself contributed to the slow, hypnotic rhythm of events. Hills rolled gently beneath gray skies. Muddy roads stretched into the distance. Trees swayed softly with the wind. Soldiers walked in lines that were more patterns than movement, their boots pressing the earth in steady, rhythmic cadence. Smoke drifted across the horizon, and the occasional boom of a distant cannon punctuated the pervasive quiet rather than shattered it. By the end of this period, Napoleon had accumulated experience, patience, and a subtle understanding of human and logistical dynamics. He moved through life with deliberate attention to detail, observing both men and terrain, calculating distances and supplies, and recording the smallest events that others might have dismissed. These early years, while slow and methodical, laid the foundation for the larger campaigns that would later capture the imagination of the world, even if they unfolded at the same deliberate pace in their earliest moments. As the years passed, Napoleon's place in the French army became a slow but steady progression. Unlike the dramatic accounts of sudden promotions and heroic leaps, the reality was a careful accumulation of paperwork, evaluations, and minor assignments. He received letters from superiors detailing administrative duties, troop rosters, and supply requests. Each morning, he would rise before dawn, walking along the quiet streets of Paris or the orderly courtyards of his barracks, observing the city as it stretched awake in the gentle gray light of early hours. The sound of distant church bells, the creaking of wagon wheels along stone streets, and the occasional bark of a dog punctuated these early mornings with a soft, repetitive rhythm that marked the passage of days more than any extraordinary event ever could. Napoleon's first experiences in command were similarly unremarkable in appearance, though meticulously noted in the annals of history. He oversaw small artillery units, inspected cannons, and wrote reports on their condition. Soldiers drilled under his watch, performing the same routines again and again, loading muskets, practicing formations, marching in circles across muddy fields. At times, smoke from test firings drifted lazily through the training ground, curling into soft, gray spirals that dissipated with the wind. Napoleon noted the alignment of cannons, the spacing of troops, the slope of the ground. Details that seemed minor, yet historians would later interpret them as evidence of the strategic mind at work. Meanwhile, the world beyond the walls of the barracks moved in slow, bureaucratic patterns. Governments debated troop movements in meetings that stretched for hours, then days, with reports passed from one clerk to another. Supplies were delayed because wagons broke down or rivers flooded. Orders arrived weeks after they were written. Napoleon learned to wait, to anticipate, to measure every action against the slow, unfolding reality of logistics and communication. Even the wind became a factor, as it could alter the course of a cannonball or the direction of smoke across a battlefield. Each observation added to the methodical foundation upon which his future campaigns would be built. It was during these slow, measured years that Napoleon began to understand the rhythms of men as well as the rhythms of armies. He noted the fatigue in soldiers' faces after repeated drills, the small irritations that could build into discontent if not carefully managed, the subtle hierarchy that existed even among those of equal rank. He kept diaries, recorded minor incidents, and reflected on what might be learned from each small success or failure. Days passed in this quiet, repetitive manner, punctuated by occasional inspections, minor skirmishes with local groups of bandits or Corsican loyalists, and the routine paperwork of an officer rising through the ranks. By the time revolutionary upheaval began to sweep through France, Napoleon had already developed a patience that would serve him well. The revolution itself unfolded slowly in its early stages. Political debates filled the halls of assemblies, pamphlets circulated quietly from hand to hand, and rumors spread along streets lined with buildings that had long histories of their own. Napoleon observed these developments, noting them in a precise, detached manner. He paid attention not to the slogans or the fervor, but to the subtle shifts in power, the changing loyalties of local authorities, and the movement of regiments within the city. The first opportunities for actual military distinction came gradually, rather than with sudden fanfare. Napoleon was sent to garrison duty, a posting that required long days of supervision, inspection, and the slow march of paperwork. He calculated artillery positions, measured distances across plains, and instructed soldiers on precise formations. Each movement of a unit, each adjustment of a cannon, unfolded over hours, often in rain or cold that dampened both clothing and spirits. The meticulous repetition of drills, marching, and calculations may have seemed monotonous to outsiders. Yet these slow, careful actions formed the groundwork for strategies that would later be described as brilliant. In 1793, during the Siege of Toulon, Napoleon's life began to move in slightly faster circles. Yet even then, events unfolded with the measured pace of careful observation and repeated adjustment. He oversaw artillery placements, noting the slope of hills and the distance to enemy positions. Cannons were loaded and fired, smoke curling upward, dissipating slowly. Reports came in from officers, detailing minor skirmishes and the positioning of troops. Napoleon read each one carefully, calculating the best placement of forces not in sudden leaps, but in small, deliberate increments. The city, the harbor, the fortifications, they were all observed in quiet, careful detail. And when the city finally fell, the victory was recorded not in a single moment of drama, but as the cumulative result of slow planning, repeated adjustments, and careful observation. Even as Napoleon's fame began to grow, the everyday life of an officer remained full of repetition. Letters, inspections, logistical calculations, and minor skirmishes dominated his days. The landscape itself contributed to the slow, hypnotic rhythm of events. Hills rolled gently beneath gray skies. Muddy roads stretched into the distance. Trees swayed softly with the wind. Soldiers walked in lines that were more patterns than movement, their boots pressing the earth in steady, rhythmic cadence. Smoke drifted across the horizon, and the occasional boom of a distant cannon punctuated the pervasive quiet rather than shattered it. By the end of this period, Napoleon had accumulated experience, patience, and a subtle understanding of human and logistical dynamics. He moved through life with deliberate attention to detail, observing both men and terrain, calculating distances and supplies, and recording the smallest events that others might have dismissed. These early years, while slow and methodical, laid the foundation for the larger campaigns that would later capture the imagination of the world, even if they unfolded at the same deliberate pace in their earliest moments. By the end of the Italian campaigns, Napoleon's reputation had grown steadily, though the increase was measured rather than explosive. Letters from Paris noted his successes, generals exchanged cautious praise, and bureaucrats updated files with the incremental progress of his victories. In practical terms, Napoleon's life remained governed by schedules, reports, and logistical minutiae. Supplies had to be accounted for, artillery inspected, and troop rotations documented. Even minor delays, muddy roads, damaged wagons, or slow communication between outposts required careful notation. The young general's days, though peppered with these accomplishments, continued in a deliberate rhythm that mirrored the quiet unfolding of a landscape at dawn. In 1798, the Egyptian campaign began, an expedition described in some histories with the grandeur of sudden conquest, yet in reality it advanced through slow and careful preparation. The fleet, consisting of ships laden with men, horses, and cannons, set sail with meticulous attention to inventory and navigation. Officers consulted maps repeatedly, double-checking distances and wind patterns. Soldiers packed supplies and food rations, each bag accounted for, each crate weighed. Napoleon himself reviewed plans for the campaign over countless hours, making adjustments not in bursts of inspiration but through steady, repeated calculations. The journey across the Mediterranean took days, sometimes weeks, with sailors moving deliberately along the decks, adjusting sails and checking ropes. Storms occasionally arose, slowing progress, but the fleet continued in its methodical, almost hypnotic advance. On board, soldiers drilled quietly in small groups. Cannons were inspected and tested, not with dramatic firing, but with slow, deliberate procedures that ensured readiness. Even the reading of orders and maps occurred at a measured pace, with officers explaining each detail multiple times to ensure understanding. Upon arrival in Egypt, the landscape itself reinforced the slow rhythm of events. The desert stretched in wide, unbroken plains. Sand shifted softly under the wind, and distant dunes rose and fell like gentle waves frozen in time. Napoleon and his officers moved slowly across this terrain, noting the placement of water sources, the elevation of hills, and the alignment of the sun. Troops marched with deliberate care, as the desert heat and uneven ground required careful pacing. Flags fluttered gently, and the faint sound of distant cannon fire from training exercises mingled with the whisper of wind across sand. Napoleon's first engagements with local forces proceeded in a similarly measured fashion. Villages were approached cautiously, reconnaissance missions advanced slowly across dunes and plains, and artillery positions were adjusted repeatedly to account for subtle changes in wind and terrain. Soldiers advanced in well-ordered lines, halting frequently to reassess positions, check supplies, or observe the environment. Smoke from cannon fire drifted lazily across the battlefield, sometimes obscuring small movements, and then gradually dissipated, leaving the desert scene almost unchanged. Even victories arrived incrementally. When a position was secured, officers spent days organizing supply chains, ensuring garrisons were properly stationed, and writing reports to France. Napoleon's observations of these processes were meticulous, noting the morale of troops, the condition of horses, and the stability of water supplies. Letters were written with care, detailing minor achievements and slow progress, and each report passed through multiple hands before reaching its final destination. Meanwhile, the broader political situation in France evolved at a similar pace. The revolution continued its slow unfolding, with assemblies debating new constitutions, councils managing administrative reforms, and citizens adjusting gradually to the changing government. Napoleon's influence, though growing, remained balanced by the slow machinery of governance. His name circulated in reports and newspapers, but the process by which reputation solidified was incremental, filled with repeated references to campaigns, modest victories, and careful observations of both allies and rivals. In the months spent in Egypt, Napoleon also focused on the study of culture, geography, and science, fields that moved even more slowly than military campaigns. He commissioned scholars, cataloged ancient monuments, and collected data about flora, fauna, and the local climate. These activities unfolded in a gentle, deliberate rhythm. Scholars walked along the Nile, taking measurements. Artists sketched slowly under the sun. Notebooks were filled with observations that might occupy weeks or months. Napoleon observed these processes with quiet attention, rarely interrupting, yet noting details with precision that would later provide the basis for lengthy historical accounts. Through all this, the Egyptian campaign maintained a tempo that was hypnotic in its repetition. Days were filled with marches, inspections, minor skirmishes, correspondence, and observation. Soldiers ate slowly, rested in shaded areas, and occasionally fired drills in preparation for engagements. Night fell with predictable regularity, and Napoleon often walked alone among the camps, considering maps by the soft glow of lanterns. The desert winds whispered through tents, and the distant call to prayer echoed with a calm persistence that framed the nightly stillness. Thus, even in campaigns often portrayed as sudden, dramatic bursts of genius and daring, the reality was that Napoleon's work proceeded in long, unhurried sequences. Success came through repeated adjustments, careful calculation, and patient attention to both people and terrain. Each day contributed a small measure to the ultimate result, like grains of sand accumulating into the desert dunes through which he marched. The grandeur of conquest was present, yes, but it was quiet, slow, and methodical, revealing the true rhythm of historical progress as experienced by one who observed all in patient, meticulous detail. After months in Egypt, Napoleon's return to France proceeded with the same deliberate rhythm that had marked much of his earlier life. The journey across the Mediterranean took several weeks, with ships moving steadily under the guidance of navigators and the careful adjustment of sails. Storms occasionally delayed progress, and at times, the fleet remained anchored near quiet coastal towns for days while officers conducted inspections, repaired minor damage, or coordinated supply transfers. Even the journey itself unfolded in a slow, almost meditative cadence, with each day passing in incremental motion rather than dramatic upheaval. Upon reaching the French coast, Napoleon found a nation still immersed in the gradual, unhurried transformations of revolutionary governance. Councils debated policies over weeks, ministers exchanged reports in careful correspondence, and citizens slowly adapted to the evolving laws and administrative structures. Napoleon's arrival was noted with measured interest. Letters were sent, announcements printed in newspapers, and local authorities prepared ceremonial receptions. The gestures of acclaim, handshakes, speeches, and gatherings, unfolded in extended sequences of polite acknowledgement rather than sudden, explosive celebration. Napoleon quickly assumed the role of observer within the political landscape, studying the subtle interactions of legislative assemblies, ministers, and influential figures. He attended meetings with careful attention, noting patterns of agreement and dissent, the timing of speeches, and the procedural rhythms that governed debate. Reports arrived daily, detailing troop positions, regional disturbances, and the slow movements of political factions. Each item required assessment, often leading to further correspondence, consultations with advisors, and methodical calculation of potential courses of action. As the months passed, Napoleon's influence increased, though it advanced incrementally. Political allies were cultivated through repeated meetings, thoughtful letters, and patient negotiation. His reputation as a successful military leader lent weight to his words. Yet even here, power was acquired not through sudden decree, but by steady accumulation of respect and authority. Historians later describe this period as Napoleon's rise to prominence, but in reality, it was a slow, deliberate process of observation, calculation, and careful action. The administrative side of his ascent demanded constant attention. Reports on regional governance, military readiness, and economic conditions flowed into his hands with regularity. Napoleon read each document, annotating margins, requesting clarification, and issuing instructions. Meetings with advisors were long and detailed, often extending over hours, as each decision was weighed carefully against multiple contingencies. Even minor orders, such as the redeployment of a regiment or the resupply of a distant garrison, required documentation, confirmation, and multiple layers of verification. This accumulation of small, deliberate acts gradually consolidated his influence, creating the foundation for later political authority. Amid these procedural undertakings, Napoleon's public persona continued to grow at a measured pace. Newspapers published accounts of his victories and observations from his campaigns. Portraits were painted in slow sessions by artists, capturing his expression with meticulous care. Letters from admirers and supporters arrived steadily, contributing to the quiet building of reputation. In public appearances, Napoleon spoke with calm deliberation, his gestures measured and precise, his tone moderate. Enthusiasm was restrained, reflecting the slow unfolding of political reality rather than the sudden excitement often portrayed in later stories. Even the planning of future military campaigns unfolded gradually. Napoleon considered potential theaters of action, studied maps for days on end, and discussed logistical possibilities with trusted aides. Each decision involved repetition, cross-referencing, and careful evaluation of supply chains, troop morale, and terrain. His attention to detail extended to minute considerations, the condition of roads, the availability of forage for horses, and the rotation schedules of units. The grandeur often attributed to his military genius was rooted in these extended, repetitive, and patient exercises, which unfolded over weeks and months rather than hours or days. By 1799, the stage for political change had been prepared not with sudden dramatic action, but with persistent, calculated steps. Napoleon's return to Paris coincided with growing dissatisfaction among various factions within the government, though these shifts occurred slowly and with considerable procedural formality. The mechanisms of governance required deliberation, consultation, and repeated action, and Napoleon exploited these rhythms with patience. His eventual appointment as first consul was the culmination of months of careful negotiation, steady observation, and methodical influence building, a gradual ascent rather than an abrupt seizure of power. During this period, Napoleon also devoted attention to the domestic and cultural life of France. He moved through Paris slowly, observing architectural layouts, inspecting public works, and reviewing urban planning initiatives. He took note of schools, military academies, and administrative buildings, all in extended, deliberate sessions of observation and study. The city itself unfolded as a complex, multi-layered environment, revealing its details and increments that required patience to comprehend fully. Each street, square, and bridge was examined, often repeatedly, to understand both its practical function and its symbolic significance. Thus, the slow consolidation of political and military authority proceeded not through bursts of dramatic action, but through a persistent, deliberate series of small, interconnected moves. Napoleon's rise, while celebrated in later histories with language of sudden brilliance, was grounded in routine, repetition, and patient attention to detail. Each report read, each meeting attended, and each minor decision made contributed incrementally to his growing influence. The story of his ascent, when told in a slow, factual manner, resembles the careful construction of a vast edifice, one stone at a time, meticulously placed, until the structure achieves monumental presence. Once installed as first consul, Napoleon's life entered a new phase of carefully structured activity. The title itself suggested power and influence, yet the reality of governance was far slower than the dramatic accounts often portray. Each day was dominated by meetings, reports, and correspondence. Ministers arrived with stacks of papers, each detailing minor administrative issues, troop assignments, tax collections, road repairs, and local disputes. Napoleon read each document with measured attention, annotating margins, and consulting aides for clarification. These were not moments of impulsive decision-making, but exercises in patient accumulation of knowledge and authority. Military matters continued to unfold at the same deliberate pace. Although Napoleon's victories in Italy had established his reputation, campaigns under his command required extensive preparation. Maps were studied for days, topography noted with precision, and troop movements calculated over weeks in advance. Units were inspected repeatedly. The alignment of artillery, the spacing of infantry, and the condition of horses and equipment all required meticulous attention. Soldiers marched in steady cadence, halted at regular intervals for rest and instruction, and practiced maneuvers repeatedly until they could be executed without hesitation. The slow rhythm of early campaigns under the consulate reflected both strategy and necessity. European allies and adversaries reacted with cautious deliberation. Treaties were negotiated over weeks, sometimes months, as envoys traveled between capitals, exchanged letters, and discussed terms. Napoleon waited, observed, and adjusted his plans according to the steady flow of information. Each minor adjustment, a regiment moved slightly to the left, a supply wagon delayed to avoid poor terrain, or a cannon repositioned on a hill, added incrementally to the eventual success of larger operations. The campaigns in Italy resumed with a methodical pace. Troops advanced across plains, rivers were crossed carefully with pontoon bridges inspected in repeated trials, and artillery placements were tested under controlled conditions. Smoke from cannon fire drifted slowly into the sky, dissipating gradually and allowing officers to reassess positions without panic. Soldiers engaged in brief skirmishes, often ending with minor territorial adjustments rather than dramatic breakthroughs. These small actions, repeated over days, eventually shaped the broader outcomes of the battles, demonstrating that strategic success was rarely the product of a single decisive act, but of patient accumulation of small, measured actions. Napoleon's attention to logistics remained central to his approach. Supply lines were monitored closely, every wagon accounted for, every ration distributed with care, every route surveyed to anticipate potential delays. Letters and reports moved slowly through the chain of command, each reviewed and annotated before any action was authorized. In this, the campaigns resembled a slow, carefully choreographed movement, more like a grand, deliberate dance than the sudden charge often depicted in paintings. Even victories arrived in a quiet, incremental fashion. Towns and fortifications were captured after extended negotiations, coordinated maneuvers, and repeated assessments of both enemy and terrain. Cannons occasionally fired in ceremonial salutes, but these bursts of sound were brief, fading into the pervasive quiet of the surrounding fields. Troops occupied captured areas, adjusting positions, inspecting fortifications, and reviewing supplies. Napoleon observed these processes with meticulous care, ensuring that each step was taken correctly, even if it required repetition over hours or days. Meanwhile, his influence in the political sphere continued to increase, though at the same gradual pace. Correspondence from allies and ministers flowed steadily, each piece of information contributing to his understanding of France's internal dynamics. Decisions on taxation, education, infrastructure, and law were implemented incrementally, often requiring repeated consultation and adjustment. The growth of power was measured not by dramatic coups, but by the cumulative effect of small, deliberate, and repeated actions. The landscape itself contributed to the hypnotic rhythm of the campaigns. Rolling hills, winding rivers, and distant forests unfolded gradually, revealing obstacles and opportunities only with careful observation. Soldiers marched steadily across these terrains, often stopping to rest, consult maps, or adjust positions. Flags and standards fluttered softly in the breeze, marking formations and providing orientation, yet moving in a slow, continuous cadence that reflected the patient pace of military life. Through these slow, deliberate movements, Napoleon shaped the armies of France into highly disciplined and coordinated forces. Success in early campaigns under the consulate was achieved not through sudden brilliance or dramatic heroics, but through meticulous planning, patient observation, and repeated execution of small, deliberate acts. Each minor adjustment contributed to larger outcomes, and each day unfolded in measured, hypnotic progression. By the close of this period, Napoleon's reputation had solidified, his authority extended, and his armies prepared for larger operations across Europe. The rhythm of his life, dominated by slow marches, repeated inspections, endless correspondence, and careful strategic calculation, created the foundation for the campaigns that would later be celebrated in history. Yet, when recounted in this slow, factual manner, the story of his rise to prominence reveals itself as a long sequence of patient, incremental achievements, rather than the sudden, dazzling exploits often depicted in paintings and literature. As the years of the consulate progressed, Napoleon's attention increasingly turned toward the wider European theater. The continent itself seemed to unfold with the same slow deliberation that characterized his campaigns. Rivers wound lazily across plains, forests shifted softly with the wind, and distant mountains rose like silent sentinels, appearing and receding gradually on the horizon. Every march required careful consideration of terrain, weather, and supply lines, and Napoleon's approach remained meticulous and deliberate. The planning of Central European campaigns demanded months of preparation. Maps were spread across tables in quiet rooms, officers hovering nearby to trace routes with fingers and measuring sticks. Hills, valleys, rivers, and forests were cataloged repeatedly, noting elevations, gradients, and potential obstacles. The movements of enemy forces were studied slowly, based on reports that often took days or weeks to arrive. Each detail, how quickly a battalion could march through a muddy field, the slope of a riverbank, the availability of forage, was recorded and analyzed with patient care. Troops moved across these lands at a measured pace. Infantry marched steadily, halting periodically to adjust formations or rest. Cavalry units trotted in consistent cadence, occasionally stopping to ensure alignment with maps and instructions. Artillery units were positioned carefully on hills, their placement determined by subtle calculations of distance, wind, and line of sight. Smoke from practice firings drifted lazily into the sky, rising slowly and dissipating over minutes, allowing Napoleon and his aides to make small adjustments before the next salvo. Even minor skirmishes were conducted with prolonged deliberation. Soldiers advanced in carefully controlled lines, halted to assess terrain, and repositioned after repeated consultation with officers. Cannons fired intermittently, their sound punctuating the pervasive quiet rather than dominating it. Each small engagement was followed by slow reports, detailing the position of troops, the condition of equipment, and the movements of enemy forces. Napoleon read each document with meticulous attention, noting every subtle factor that could influence the next stage of operations. The lead-up to the Battle of Austerlitz exemplified this extended rhythm. Napoleon's army, though celebrated in later history as a force of swift brilliance, moved deliberately across the countryside. Weeks were spent on reconnaissance, positioning troops incrementally, and preparing supply lines. Villages were surveyed, roads assessed, and high ground analyzed repeatedly. Officers and soldiers alike engaged in slow, methodical training, rehearsing maneuvers, and ensuring readiness for eventual engagement. The environment itself imposed a calm, persistent tempo. Fog settled over fields in the early morning, rivers meandered quietly, and the distant hills remained unmoving until long after the sun had risen. Even the psychological aspect of warfare was approached gradually. Napoleon observed enemy movements with quiet patience, noting patterns, predicting likely responses, and issuing instructions that required repeated execution. Soldiers were encouraged to follow strict routines, both to maintain discipline and to create conditions in which careful, incremental adjustments could be implemented without confusion. Reports from spies and scouts arrived in measured intervals, each adding a layer of understanding that informed slow, deliberate decisions. Letters and correspondence continued to structure the tempo of daily life. Napoleon dictated reports to aides, who recorded them with careful handwriting, annotating every paragraph. Responses from political leaders, allied commanders, and local administrators arrived over weeks, each requiring attention and cross-referencing with other information. Even ceremonial aspects, such as the review of troops or the reception of envoys, proceeded according to deliberate schedules. Nothing occurred instantaneously. Every achievement, every movement, unfolded in patient succession. The battle itself, when it arrived, reflected this measured pace. Cannons fired, but with long pauses, allowing the smoke to clear and the terrain to be reassessed. Infantry advanced slowly, halting to maintain formation and observe the enemy. Cavalry moved along predetermined paths, stopping at calculated points to support flanks. Flags fluttered gently above the columns, and the sound of marching feet and distant cannon booms created a steady, hypnotic rhythm rather than a sudden surge of chaos. Napoleon, walking among his troops, observed, instructed, and adjusted, each movement deliberate and precise. Even after the engagement concluded, the process of consolidating the battlefield was slow. Troops were repositioned, supply lines checked, and minor repairs conducted on artillery and equipment. Reports were written in careful detail, noting casualties, terrain conditions, and the disposition of forces. Victory, as celebrated in later accounts, was achieved not through a single act of brilliance, but through patient, incremental adjustments that had accumulated over weeks and months. Through this slow, meticulous process, Napoleon's influence extended steadily across Central Europe. Territories were secured through a combination of careful military planning, methodical diplomacy, and repeated administrative action. Each decision, no matter how minor, contributed to the gradual expansion of his power. And as with earlier campaigns, the grandeur of achievement was less a sudden spectacle than the culmination of persistent, measured effort. Even in moments that might later be dramatized, the reality was filled with quiet repetition. Soldiers marched and drilled, maps were consulted and redrawn, orders were issued and confirmed. Flags fluttered lazily, rivers ran without hurry, and the sun rose and fell in the steady, predictable rhythm of days that seemed to stretch into one another. Napoleon's genius, therefore, was not in rapid action but in the patient orchestration of countless small, deliberate movements, each building upon the last to produce the outcomes remembered by history. By the winter of 1805, Napoleon's preparations for the engagement near Austerlitz had reached a meticulous, almost ritualistic pace. The army moved deliberately across the gentle plains of Moravia, each regiment maintaining steady intervals, halting periodically to adjust formations, inspect equipment, and allow soldiers a momentary rest. Snow lay thinly across the landscape, drifting in slow, irregular patterns that blurred the edges of roads and hills. The wind whispered across the fields, bending grass and brushing against cloaks, carrying the faint scent of earth and distant fires. Napoleon himself observed the terrain with patient attention. He traced the contours of hills and valleys with fingers pressed lightly against maps, considering angles of approach and positions for artillery. Each ridge was measured, each depression noted, each possible path of advance weighed slowly against the available forces. His aides moved quietly beside him, offering minor observations, while officers adjusted their troops according to subtle recommendations. Every motion was deliberate, repetitive, and carefully catalogued, reinforcing the steady rhythm that characterized all of Napoleon's military activity. The build-up to engagement unfolded over days rather than hours. Scouts moved slowly across the snowy fields, reporting enemy positions, troop strengths, and likely movements. Cannons were positioned on hills, their placement adjusted repeatedly after test firings. Infantry formations advanced in small increments, halting to consult maps, receive instructions, and correct alignment. Cavalry units followed a similar pattern, moving steadily along predetermined paths, stopping to ensure coordination with other units. The battlefield itself seemed to exist in a quiet, suspended time, each detail emerging gradually rather than all at once. Even the enemy's movements contributed to the hypnotic tempo. Allied forces advanced, retreated, and shifted position over hours, their actions measured, deliberate, and often slow. Napoleon observed carefully, noting the patterns of response, the timing of adjustments, and the small discrepancies that could be exploited. Orders were given with calm precision. A battery here, an infantry column there, a minor repositioning of cavalry. Each instruction was repeated and reinforced, ensuring that execution would proceed smoothly across the wide, snowy expanse. When the battle finally commenced in earnest, it maintained this slow, hypnotic rhythm. Cannons fired intermittently, smoke rising in long, curling wisps that hung in the cold air. Infantry advanced in measured lines, halting frequently to maintain formation and assess terrain. Cavalry moved steadily, weaving between columns and occupying strategic points, their horses' hooves pressing rhythmically into the snow. Flags fluttered gently, marking positions, while the sound of marching boots and distant artillery created a consistent, almost hypnotic beat. Napoleon moved among his troops with deliberate care. He observed, instructed, and corrected, each action measured and precise. Decisions were made slowly, informed by careful observation of terrain, the position of enemy forces, and the status of his own men. Even moments that would later be depicted as sudden brilliance, an unexpected maneuver of cavalry, a decisive artillery placement, unfolded as a series of small, patient adjustments carried out over hours. Each move built upon previous observations and careful calculations, producing outcomes that only appeared dramatic in retrospect. After the engagement, the process of consolidation began with the same measured pace. Troops were repositioned, supplies accounted for, and minor repairs conducted on artillery and equipment. Reports were written slowly, noting positions, casualties, terrain conditions, and enemy movements. The victory, while celebrated in later accounts with dramatic flair, had been achieved through a long sequence of patient, incremental actions, marches, adjustments, and repeated assessments, rather than sudden, explosive feats. Even the surrounding landscape seemed to participate in this slow rhythm. Snow drifted lazily across hills and plains. Rivers meandered quietly, frozen in some places and flowing gently in others. Flags fluttered softly in the wind. Smoke from cannon practice and distant fires rose slowly, dissolving into the pale sky. Soldiers moved in steady cadence, their boots pressing into the snow with rhythmic precision. And through it all, Napoleon maintained his careful observation, adjusting, instructing, and ensuring that the results of the day's labor would persist into the following days. This pattern continued throughout subsequent campaigns in Europe. From the plains of Austria to the rolling hills of Prussia, Napoleon's methods remained consistent. Patient observation, repeated adjustment, meticulous attention to detail, and slow, deliberate execution. Each victory, each maneuver, each minor adjustment contributed incrementally to his growing power. Even as his fame expanded and his influence deepened, the underlying rhythm of his life, steady, measured, and hypnotic, remained unchanged. Through these years, the slow, repetitive cadence of military and political life became almost meditative. Reports, letters, and minor engagements provided the soundtrack to each day. Soldiers marched, halted, and adjusted. Artillery fired in measured intervals. Envoys carried correspondence across long distances. Napoleon moved through this world with deliberate attention, shaping outcomes not through sudden brilliance alone, but through the patient orchestration of countless small, incremental actions, each unfolding in quiet succession across the slowly turning landscape of Europe. Following the careful orchestration of Austerlitz, Napoleon's attention gradually shifted to consolidating his influence across the wider European continent. The territories he had won required ongoing management, each day filled with methodical inspections, reports, and minor adjustments. Governors were appointed to administer newly acquired regions, and each report on the state of roads, fortifications, and local populations was read slowly, annotated meticulously, and acted upon in careful increments. Even the mundane work of ensuring that taxes were collected and supply lines maintained demanded patient attention, and Napoleon approached these tasks with the same deliberate precision he had applied to troop movements on the battlefield. As campaigns extended into Prussia and Poland, the tempo of military operations remained measured. Soldiers marched steadily across plains and rivers, halting for rest, reconnaissance, or repositioning. Artillery units were checked repeatedly, and cavalry maneuvers were rehearsed with slow, repetitive precision. Smoke from cannons drifted lazily across fields, dissipating gradually, allowing commanders to assess terrain and adjust their positions accordingly. Even the smallest details, such as the alignment of flags or the spacing of infantry formations, were observed and corrected, contributing incrementally to the cumulative success of each engagement. In Spain, Napoleon's operations took on a different character, yet the underlying rhythm persisted. Guerrilla actions and skirmishes unfolded slowly, with repeated adjustments to troop placements, supply routes, and communications. Soldiers moved carefully through villages, ensuring that local populations were managed in a way that minimized disorder. Maps were consulted repeatedly, and small adjustments were made to each plan as information arrived gradually from scouts and officers. The chaos often associated with the peninsular campaigns was tempered in Napoleon's own approach by patient, deliberate observation, though history would later emphasize the dramatic nature of these events. During this period, Napoleon also attended to the administration and ceremonial aspects of power. His coronation as emperor in 1804 was, in reality, the culmination of months of careful preparation. The ceremony itself unfolded slowly, with detailed planning of processions, arrangements of clergy and officials, and placement of ceremonial regalia. Each step, the entry into the cathedral, the placement of the crown, the reading of prayers, was executed deliberately, rehearsed over and over, ensuring that every motion conformed to meticulous standards. The grandeur celebrated in history books was grounded in these extended, methodical preparations, executed in precise sequence rather than spontaneous flair. Even daily life at the Tuileries Palace reflected this measured tempo. Ministers arrived in ordered succession, each reporting on their domain with detailed accounts that were read and responded to patiently. Correspondence accumulated slowly, with letters drafted, revised, and signed after careful consideration. Military plans were reviewed repeatedly, maps consulted, and potential maneuvers discussed at length. The slow cadence of palace life mirrored the rhythm of the battlefield, steady, deliberate, and reliant on incremental adjustments rather than sudden actions. Napoleon's campaigns across Europe, in particular, continued to unfold with hypnotic rhythm. The marches of troops, the movement of artillery, the slow accumulation of intelligence from spies and scouts, all proceeded in measured steps. Battles, while often dramatized later, were the result of patient positioning, repeated maneuvers, and careful observation of enemy movements. Smoke from artillery hung in the air, dispersing slowly, while infantry advanced and halted in deliberate cadence. Cavalry moved in carefully calculated arcs, adjusting positions repeatedly based on minor shifts in terrain or enemy response. Even the broader political landscape moved in slow increments. Treaties were negotiated over weeks, correspondence flowed gradually, and alliances formed and shifted through repeated discussions and formal ceremonies. Napoleon's influence expanded methodically. Each small concession, each repeated demonstration of authority, contributed to the steady consolidation of power. The European continent, in this perspective, was a vast chessboard, with each small, incremental movement of armies, diplomats, and resources building toward larger strategic outcomes. The hypnotic rhythm of this period extended to all aspects of life under Napoleon. Soldiers drilled in steady repetition, officers wrote and rewrote reports, couriers carried dispatches across long distances, and officials adjusted administrative measures incrementally. Even natural elements, the shifting light across fields, the slow flow of rivers, the drifting of clouds, seemed to echo the deliberate tempo of human activity. Every achievement, every maneuver, every ceremonial act was part of a patient, persistent progression rather than sudden, dramatic triumph. By the mid-1800s, Napoleon had established an empire built on slow, careful accumulation of influence, power, and experience. The campaigns that secured his dominance were less the product of sudden genius than of countless, patient adjustments executed over months and years. Every report read, every soldier positioned, every minor engagement carried out with meticulous attention contributed incrementally to the broader outcomes that later historians celebrated as sweeping victories. By 1812, Napoleon's attention had shifted eastward, toward the vast expanses of Russia. The planning of the campaign was exhaustive, deliberate, and, in many ways, hypnotically repetitive. Maps were studied repeatedly, distances measured, and potential routes across rivers, forests, and plains analyzed with painstaking care. Each regiment's pace was calculated, supply lines plotted with incremental adjustments, and every decision weighed against multiple contingencies. Even small variables, such as the capacity of local towns to provide food, the flow of rivers, or the slope of a gentle hill, were noted meticulously. The Grande Army began its march with slow precision. Soldiers advanced steadily, halting regularly to rest, consult maps, or adjust formations. Cannons were moved with care, their wheels sinking slightly into soft earth, necessitating repeated inspections and minor corrections. Cavalry units trotted in steady cadence, sometimes halting for hours while scouts reported on distant villages or forested approaches. Snow, mud, and uneven terrain dictated a gradual rhythm. Each day's progress seemed minimal, yet these small, deliberate movements accumulated across hundreds of miles. Even the first encounters with Russian forces followed this measured pace. Skirmishes involved careful positioning, incremental adjustments, and repeated consultation among officers. Artillery fired intermittently, smoke drifting slowly across the cold air. Infantry moved in lines that advanced and halted with gentle deliberation rather than sudden, dramatic charges. Each minor engagement produced reports that required careful reading and annotation, detailing troop movements, terrain, and supply status. Napoleon reviewed these documents slowly, making calculated adjustments that unfolded over days rather than hours. The vastness of Russia itself imposed a hypnotic rhythm on the campaign. Forests stretched endlessly, rivers meandered quietly, and snow drifted in slow, curling patterns across plains and hills. Villages appeared and receded gradually on the horizon, their inhabitants moving with a calm, methodical pace. Each step of the army required patience, bridging rivers, securing forage, and adjusting to weather conditions that changed imperceptibly from day to day. The slow passage of time became an omnipresent factor, influencing the tempo of movements and the pacing of decisions. Logistics, as ever, dominated the rhythm of the campaign. Supply wagons moved steadily along roads, halting periodically to repair broken wheels or rest exhausted horses. Provisions were distributed methodically, each ration accounted for. Letters and reports were carried slowly across distances, often taking days to reach their destination. Even minor adjustments, such as the repositioning of a battalion or a small detachment sent to secure a village, were executed in careful sequence, reinforcing the patient pace that defined the entire operation. The slow attrition of forces in Russia further reinforced this hypnotic rhythm. Soldiers marched for days through mud and snow, halting repeatedly to rest, check equipment, and recalibrate formations. Cavalry moved in gentle arcs across open fields, artillery repositioned over hills with repeated adjustments, and infantry formations adjusted incrementally based on the movements of the enemy. Smoke from occasional cannon fire rose lazily into the pale sky, dispersing gradually, and leaving the scene almost unchanged. Each day was a measured sequence of repetitive actions, producing gradual effects that only became significant in hindsight. Even retreat, later dramatized as chaotic, unfolded with deliberate, albeit weary, movements. Units withdrew slowly, halting at intervals to maintain order, account for men and horses, and assess terrain. Supply lines were re-established incrementally, maps consulted repeatedly, and each movement carefully logged. Snow drifted gently across roads, rivers flowed silently, and the distant forests remained unmoving, as though time itself had slowed to match the patient pace of human activity. During these years, Napoleon's administration mirrored the same hypnotic, repetitive rhythm. Reports arrived from occupied territories, detailing political, economic, and social conditions. Each document was read slowly, annotated, and acted upon with incremental adjustments. Ministers submitted proposals for reforms or taxation, which were reviewed repeatedly, debated, and modified over weeks. The consolidation of the empire, like its expansion, depended less on sudden brilliance than on persistent, patient, and repetitive acts of observation, calculation, and minor adjustment. Even the daily life of soldiers reflected this methodical tempo. Meals were consumed slowly, drills repeated with calm precision, and minor repairs conducted with steady hands. Letters were written and delivered incrementally. Officers adjusted troop positions repeatedly, and minor skirmishes occurred in long, drawn-out sequences. The grandeur of Napoleon's campaigns, often depicted as swift and dramatic, emerged from these countless small, deliberate acts executed over extended periods. By the end of the Russian campaign, the cumulative effect of these slow movements became tragically clear. Troops were exhausted, supply lines strained, and morale diminished incrementally over weeks and months. Snow and mud impeded progress, each step demanding effort and patience. Retreat, like advance, was composed of repeated adjustments, halting, regrouping, securing provisions, and realigning formations. The landscape itself seemed to echo the slow attrition. Forests, rivers, and plains offered no sudden changes, only the persistent, incremental passage of time. Even in moments that might later be portrayed as decisive, the underlying rhythm remained the same. Patient observation, repeated adjustments, careful attention to detail, and incremental execution. Battles, marches, and administrative decisions were all part of a long, hypnotic sequence, with each small action contributing to the larger outcomes that would define Napoleon's later legacy. The dawn rose slowly over the vast plains, spreading a pale golden light across the soft mist that still clung to the fields. The air was silent for a moment, as if the entire landscape held its breath, waiting for something to begin. And in that stillness, a lone figure stood near the crest of a gentle hill, cloaked in his dark navy overcoat and wearing the unmistakable bicorn hat. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, watched the horizon not with fear, nor with hesitation, but with the calm, collected gaze of a man who had walked across countless battlefields and shaped the destinies of nations. His horse stamped the ground softly behind him, its breath making little clouds in the morning air. Officers stood at a respectful distance, whispering quietly, holding maps, adjusting swords, and glancing toward their commander. Though the men around him felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation, Napoleon himself appeared almost serene. He had been here before, many times. The smell of damp earth, gunpowder lingering from skirmishes the previous night, the distant silhouettes of enemy lines gathering strength. These were things he knew intimately, as if they were old companions. Slowly, he stepped forward, the dew on the grass brushing the edges of his boots. The fields stretched wide and open before him. Soon, they would be filled with smoke, thunder, and chaos. But for now, the calm of early morning held everything in a delicate balance. Napoleon inhaled deeply. He always believed that the true battlefield began long before the fighting actually started. It began in the mind, in the plans made quietly, in the choices shaped before any sword was drawn. A soft rustle behind him signaled the arrival of Marshal Berthier, his loyal chief of staff. "Sire," Berthier said, bowing slightly. "The troops are assembled. The artillery is in final position, as you ordered." Napoleon nodded gently. "Good. And the cavalry?" "Awaiting your signal, Majesty." He gazed across the plains again, and for a brief moment, his mind wandered to memories of former battles, of Austerlitz, where a morning like this turned into one of the most decisive victories in history, of Jena, where the enemy lines collapsed under the precision of French maneuvers, of Wagram, with its fierce heat and thunderous cannons. Each battle had carried its own lessons, its own challenges, its own turning points that shaped his legend. But today was different. Every battle was different. The enemy, the terrain, the weather, the morale of his men. Each factor formed an unpredictable equation that only a brilliant mind could solve. Napoleon prided himself on solving it. Behind him, the French infantry stood in long, disciplined lines. Their blue coats were neat, their muskets polished, their faces marked with a quiet determination. Many were young, some barely older than boys, yet they trusted him. They believed that as long as Napoleon stood at the front, victory was possible, almost inevitable. This trust was a weight he carried with strange comfort. It gave him purpose. The rising sun grew brighter, warming the cold morning slightly. Flags fluttered, drums beat a slow rolling rhythm, and officers on horseback rode up and down the lines making final checks. The entire army was waking up, stretching across the fields like a living organism preparing for action. Napoleon sensed the energy building, the tension rising like the moment before a storm breaks. A courier galloped toward him with news from the scouts. "Sire, enemy movement detected on the right flank. Their cavalry is shifting into a new formation." Napoleon took the message, scanned it quickly, and folded it back with a thoughtful nod. "As expected," he murmured. "They are cautious this morning. They want us to strike first." He turned to Berthier. "Send orders to Davout. Tell him to hold, but remain ready. We wait. Let the enemy show their hand first." Waiting was one of Napoleon's greatest strengths. Many commanders grew impatient, eager to attack, but Napoleon understood the value of timing. A moment too early or a moment too late could change the entire outcome of a battle. And so he watched, silently, allowing the morning to unfold. As the mist lifted, the enemy army became clearer, a great mass of soldiers, artillery, and cavalry lines stretching across the other side of the field. Their banners swayed in the wind. Their armor shone faintly in the rising sun. It was a formidable sight, but Napoleon did not flinch. Instead, he spoke softly to himself, almost inaudibly. Every battle is won before it is fought. His officers exchanged looks, knowing he was already calculating, analyzing, and predicting the next steps. Napoleon's mind was always several moves ahead, like a master chess player. Minutes passed. The tension grew stronger. A bird flew overhead, cutting across the open sky. A small, fleeting symbol of peace in a place soon to be filled with conflict. Finally, Napoleon stepped toward his horse. The officers straightened. Soldiers looked up. The entire French line seemed to sense that the moment was near. He mounted with calm precision and lifted his chin, eyes fixed forward. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady and clear, "today we write another page in history." The officers saluted, and the echoes of command began to spread across the field. The battlefield was waking up, and Napoleon was ready. The morning continued to brighten, yet the sun did little to warm the anxious hearts spread across the plains. Soldiers tightened their grips on muskets. Horses shifted on restless hooves. Far away, the enemy lines shimmered behind a thin haze, as if the heat of anticipation already rose from the ground. But in the center of all this tension sat Napoleon, upright on his horse, as steady as an ancient monument carved in stone. For a moment, he simply observed. His gaze swept from the left flank to the right, studying every detail, the distances, the slopes, the spaces between formations. He noticed how the enemy infantry leaned slightly forward, how their cavalry edged closer to the front, how their cannons were angled. To many, these signs were small and insignificant. To Napoleon, they spoke like a language he had mastered. Berthier rode up again, his expression a mixture of readiness and concern. "Sire, the men await your command." "Shall we?" "Not yet," Napoleon interrupted gently. "The enemy still hesitates." He pointed toward the opposing line. "Look closely, Berthier. They shift weight from one foot to another. They adjust their coats. They glance toward their officers. Their nerves betray them. They expect us to move first. But we will not." Berthier nodded, impressed as always by Napoleon's ability to read the battlefield like a book. The emperor lowered his telescope and handed it back to an aide. "Let them stew," he added. "A waiting army grows restless. A restless army grows weak." Below the hill, the French regiments stood silent but alert. Columns of infantry held tight formations. Grenadiers with tall bearskin hats looked forward with fierce discipline. The cuirassiers, heavy cavalry clad in polished breastplates, sat on powerful horses ready to charge at a moment's notice. Drummers sat quietly, tapping fingers against their drums in anticipation of the thunder they would soon unleash. The atmosphere thickened as if the air itself carried the weight of the coming clash. A faint breeze swept across the field, tugging gently at Napoleon's coat. He closed his eyes for a brief second, listening to the quiet noises of the camp, the creaking of leather straps, the faint mutter of troops, distant neighs of horses. In this stillness, he found clarity. At last, he straightened and turned to Berthier. "Bring me the division commanders." Within minutes, a circle of seasoned marshals gathered around him. Ney, Davout, Lens, Soult, men whose names echoed across Europe. Their faces were stern, yet respectful. They knew that whatever answers Napoleon gave would shape the hours to come. Napoleon unfolded a large map across a portable table. The marshals leaned in. "The enemy delays," Napoleon said calmly, tapping a position with his gloved finger. "Their center is strong, but their right flank, here, is overextended. They have stretched themselves thin to intimidate us, but they do not expect a concentrated strike there." Marshal Ney grinned, sensing the plan. "A hammer blow to break their right." Napoleon nodded. "Exactly, but not yet. First, we make them believe we intend to attack their center." He turned to Soult. "Advance your divisions slightly. Not enough to engage, just enough to provoke their suspicion." Soult bowed. "As you command, sire." Napoleon continued, his voice smooth and deliberate. "Their artillery will reposition to defend the center. Once they do, they weaken their flank even further." Davout leaned forward. And then, Napoleon said, with a faint smile, "We strike where they least expect, hard and fast." A murmur of approval rippled through the marshals. They trusted him, not blindly, but based on years of shared victories and trials. Napoleon rolled up the map. The meeting ended as swiftly as it began. Orders flew across the battlefield like sparks. French columns shifted with quiet precision, their movements calculated to create a deceptive pattern. The enemy observed from afar, unsure of what to make of these subtle advances. Minutes stretched into an hour. The enemy, noticing the French infantry inching toward their center, acted just as Napoleon predicted. Their cannons rolled closer. Their soldiers tightened formation. Officers shouted commands. Napoleon watched the changes unfold, almost like an artist admiring a painting he expected to see. Everything aligned with his prediction. "Patience," he whispered to himself. Patience wins empires. A messenger galloped toward him from the left flank. Sire, enemy cavalry is shifting inward toward the center. Napoleon's eyes sharpened. Good. Very good. They feast on the bait. He turned to Berthier. Send word to Davout. Prepare for the flank maneuver. But hold the attack until my order. All across the field, the French army braced for movement. Muskets glimmered under the sun. Cannons stood ready. The drums remained silent but poised. Napoleon raised his telescope once again. Through the glass, he saw the enemy officers scrambling, pointing, and adjusting their lines. Confusion crept through their ranks like a shadow. He lowered the telescope and sat still for a moment, letting the scene settle in his mind. This precise moment was the essence of command. When knowledge, instinct, timing, and courage came together to shape destiny. A sudden boom echoed across the plains. One cannon shot. Just one. It came from the enemy's side, a nervous gunner pulling the trigger too early, unable to bear the weighting. The cannonball soared through the air, landing harmlessly in an empty patch of ground, kicking up dirt. The French soldiers stiffened. The tension broke. Napoleon exhaled slowly. So, he said, they have fired the first shot. Berthier leaned in. Shall we respond, sire? Napoleon raised his hand. Not yet. He closed his eyes and listened to the silence that followed the enemy's premature strike. The air felt different now, charged, alive, ready. Then, opening his eyes with calm determination, he whispered the words that would ignite the day. Sound the drums. Drummers lifted their sticks. The first slow, heavy roll thundered across the French lines. The battlefield had begun to breathe. The drums rolled like distant thunder sweeping across the plains, a deep, steady rhythm that echoed through the hearts of every soldier in the French line. The sound crept across the battlefield, slipping beneath the mist, bouncing against the earth, rising into the sky like a signal to the gods of war. It was not yet the sound of attack. It was the sound of awakening, an army stretching its limbs, gathering its breath, preparing for what was to come. Napoleon sat tall on his horse, the rhythmic pulse reminding him of countless mornings like this, moments when history seemed to pause for one precise heartbeat. The men around him straightened. The air vibrated with the beginning of movement, subtle yet unmistakable. Across the field, the enemy reacted sharply. Their lines tightened. Flags waved hurried commands. Officers barked orders, trying to guess whether this drumming signaled an immediate charge or a mere repositioning. Their uncertainty played perfectly into Napoleon's plan. Slowly, Napoleon lifted his hand, and the drumming changed. It shifted from a low, awakening rhythm to a marching cadence. French infantry formations began to advance, not to attack, but to press forward just enough to deepen the enemy's fear. Rows of blue-coated soldiers stepped in unison. Their bayonets glimmered like silver teeth catching the morning light. Their faces were calm, disciplined, focused. Steady, Napoleon murmured under his breath. Make them think we come for their center. Make them commit. On the far ridge, several enemy cannons angled downward, anticipating a frontal assault. Their artillerymen loaded shells nervously. Some hands shook. The anticipation was beginning to break their composure. Napoleon watched everything with quiet satisfaction. Marshal Ney rode forward, his fiery red hair catching the sunlight. Sire, shall I prepare the cavalry for a direct strike? Napoleon gave a faint smile. Ney was always eager for the charge, his heart beating as fiercely as the drums. But today required finesse. Not yet, Ney, Napoleon answered. The cavalry will have their moment, but the stage must be set first. Ney nodded, though impatience flickered in his eyes. Meanwhile, on the right flank, Davout's men waited like coiled springs. They knew their moment would come, and when it did, it would come with force. They stayed silent, hidden slightly by a low ridge, their presence unnoticed by the enemy, who remained fixated on the French center. Minutes turned into tense stretches of time. The French kept advancing slowly, step by step, never breaking formation. Officers walked beside their troops, swords drawn but pointed downward, a gesture of confidence rather than aggression. Napoleon lowered his gaze to the infantry moving past him. Many of these men had followed him through countless campaigns. He saw familiar faces, scarred veterans with stern eyes, and young soldiers pretending not to tremble. A young grenadier looked up as he marched past. The boy's eyes met Napoleon's. For a moment, something passed between them, a silent exchange, a promise. The emperor gave a small nod, and the soldier's steps grew steadier. The trust of his men was a mantle Napoleon wore as heavily as any royal robe. It was both a burden and a source of endless strength. The drums continued. The march advanced, and the enemy's nerves frayed. At last, Napoleon raised his telescope to his eye again. He scanned the enemy's center, then the right, then the left. There, just as he predicted, the enemy had pulled another regiment from their right flank to reinforce the center. Their line sagged like a rope losing tension. Napoleon lowered the telescope with a soft exhale. It is time. He gestured for Berthier. Send word to Davout. The flank attack begins on my signal. Berthier nodded and sped off. Napoleon took one more moment to observe the battlefield. It was like watching a giant puzzle move into place. The sun had risen fully now, bathing the field in a hard, clear light. Shadows stretched long and sharp. The enemy army bristled with nervous readiness, completely unaware that their greatest vulnerability had just opened. With a subtle shift, Napoleon turned his horse toward the right flank. His staff followed like a small comet tail. Dust rose beneath the hooves as they descended the hill and cut across the field. When Napoleon approached Davout's position, the troops straightened even more. The marshal saluted. Davout was calm, precise, and lethal, one of Napoleon's best. "Sire," Davout said, "my men are ready." Napoleon scanned the regiments forming the hammer that would strike the enemy's exposed flank. Light infantry crouched low in the grass, waiting like wolves. Heavy cavalry lined behind them, horses pawing the earth. Artillery teams stood by their guns, fuses ready. "Your moment has arrived," Napoleon said quietly. "The enemy is stretched thin. Their right is vulnerable. When I give the order, you will smash through them, decisively." Davout nodded once. No wasted words. Napoleon rode slowly down the line. Soldiers stood taller as he passed. He looked each regiment in the eyes, as if imprinting his confidence directly onto their spirits. When the drums change, Napoleon announced, loud enough for the nearest units to hear, "The attack begins. Strike fast, strike strong, and let the world remember this day." A murmur of determination rose from the ranks. Napoleon returned to the center, back to the hill that gave him the best view. He sat quietly for a moment, breathing deeply. Everything was ready. The enemy had committed to defending the wrong place. His men held their positions. The timing was perfect. Napoleon closed his hand around the reins, feeling the energy of the horse beneath him. The battlefield trembled not from explosions, but from the weight of expectation. He looked at Berthier. "Change the drums." Berthier signaled. A moment passed, a brief, trembling silence. Then, boom, boom, boom. A faster, sharper rhythm blasted across the French lines. It was the signal. Flags rose. Sabers lifted. Cavalry leaned forward. Infantry surged. Davout's entire flank exploded into motion like a thunderbolt unleashed. Napoleon watched, eyes sharp, voice steady. "It begins," he whispered. The moment Davout's flank thundered into action, the battlefield transformed. What had been slow, tense, and patient suddenly erupted with life. The sharp rhythm of the drums pushed through the air like a driving heartbeat. Horses roared forward. Infantry surged with renewed purpose. Dust exploded beneath boots and hooves, as if the earth itself had awakened in a violent tremor. From his vantage on the hill, Napoleon watched the movement with an expression both calm and razor-focused. Every detail mattered now. The angle of Davout's advance, the distance between the French columns, the reaction of the enemy. All of it unfolded like a living map before him. Davout's troops moved swiftly along the ridge, invisible for a brief moment as they dipped behind the terrain. When they reappeared, they burst onto the enemy's exposed right flank like a storm breaking through clouds. French light infantry led the charge, speeding ahead with agility. They fired in quick succession, their shots cracking sharply across the field. Smoke puffed into the air, drifting along the breeze. Behind them, the heavy infantry marched in solid blocks, bayonets glinting like a wall of steel. Their uniforms, dust-covered yet proud, moved in perfect rhythm. And farther back, still hidden, still waiting, the French cavalry poised for the decisive blow. Napoleon lowered his telescope, his jaw set firmly. The first part of the plan was unfolding exactly as intended. But a battlefield is a living creature, unpredictable and wild. Even the greatest strategy must adapt moment by moment. "Sire," Berthier called, riding up swiftly. "The enemy has noticed the flank attack. Their commanders are sending reinforcements." Napoleon nodded slowly. He had expected this. Yes, they have no other choice. He gazed across the field. But they will be too late. Down below, the enemy's right flank struggled to react. Their lines wavered like a rope snapping under pressure. Officers shouted, waving swords, trying to pull the units back into cohesion. But Davout's attack was too sudden, too precise. A roar rose from the French infantry as they pushed deeper into the enemy's formation. Muskets fired. Bayonets clashed. Through smoke and dust, the first signs of collapse appeared. A gap forming, a regiment pulling back, a flag falling. Napoleon's eyes narrowed. This was the moment he waited for. "Ney!" Napoleon called sharply. Marshal Ney galloped forward, sparks of excitement in his eyes. "Sire, prepare the cavalry. They move on my order." Ney grinned fiercely. Finally, Napoleon didn't smile. His focus was absolute. Timing now was everything. Too early, the cavalry would face resistance. Too late, the enemy might recover. He watched, measuring every heartbeat. On the field, the enemy's right flank faltered further. Men stumbled. Horses turned in confusion. Cannon crews panicked, attempting to reposition their guns, but finding themselves overwhelmed by the French advance. Davout's infantry pushed forward like a tidal wave crashing against a fragile shore. And then came the sound. A distant horn. A desperate call from the enemy lines. It was the signal of distress. Napoleon heard it, even from his hilltop. He lifted his hand. Ney tensed, gripping the reins. Napoleon held still. Just one more second. One more breath. The exact moment had to be perfect. He watched a final instant as a large portion of the enemy's right wing broke formation and began to retreat. That was it. Napoleon's hand sliced downward. "Now," he commanded. Ney's cavalry erupted forward like a force unleashed from the depths of the earth. Thousands of horses surged into motion, breastplates flashing, sabers raised. The thunder of their hooves shook the ground. Napoleon exhaled. This was the hammer. Cavalry charges were breathtaking, terrifying, unstoppable when executed at the right moment, and this moment was flawless. The French heavy cavalry smashed into the collapsing enemy flank with such force that entire units scattered. The enemy's cavalry attempted to resist, but they were outnumbered, disorganized, and reacting too late. Napoleon watched with unwavering eyes. "The right flank is finished." Berthier nodded. "Sire, shall we press the center?" "Not yet." Napoleon pointed toward the enemy's left. "First, they must see their flank destroyed. Let fear take root." Fear was a weapon, and Napoleon knew how to wield it. Below, the battlefield roared with chaos. Horses collided, soldiers fell, muskets fired blindly through the smoke. But through it all, The French advance pushed relentlessly forward. Davout's infantry broke through fully, forcing the enemy into a disordered retreat. Some units attempted to turn and regroup, but Ney's cavalry cut them down with sweeping precision. The enemy line now bent sharply, twisted into an awkward angle. Like a cracked shield, it struggled to hold. Napoleon raised his telescope again. The enemy commander on the opposite ridge was gesturing wildly, trying to shift troops from the center to bolster the failing flank. But now, every movement was too slow. Panic had already begun to spread. "Look at them," Napoleon said softly. "Their strength drains away like water through open fingers." He could sense the shift in morale, almost like a change in the wind. The French troops felt it too. Their cheers grew louder. Their movements sharpened. Victory felt within reach. Napoleon turned to his officers. "Signal the left wing. They will begin advancing. Slowly at first, then with speed." One of the officers hesitated. "Sire, the left?" But their left flank still holds strength. Napoleon's eyes sharpened. "Not after their center weakens. They will crumble between both sides." The officer saluted, understanding now. Across the field, new movements surged as the French left wing advanced, creating pressure on the entire enemy line. What had begun as a deception was transforming into full encirclement. Napoleon closed his telescope. The sounds of battle reached him clearer now: metal clashing, horses screaming, men shouting, cannons pounding the earth. And yet, through all the noise, he maintained utter calm. The battlefield was shifting exactly as he had envisioned. Smoke drifted across his face. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder. The sun climbed higher above him. Napoleon whispered, almost to himself, "The balance of the battle has tipped." Below him, the enemy army began to break. As dawn approached over the wide European plain, the air settled into a heavy silence that felt almost unnatural. The wind that had whispered through the dry grass at night grew quiet, as if even the breeze understood that something significant was about to unfold. The battlefield, once an ordinary stretch of earth, now carried the faint scent of burned wood, gunpowder residue, and trampled grass. It seemed to wait, patiently, for thousands of men to begin the dance of war once again. Napoleon had not slept more than a few hours. Like every commander who understood the magnitude of the coming day, he felt the pressure weighing on his mind, though he showed none of it externally. A small campfire flickered beside him, its orange glow lighting the folds of his navy coat. A stable boy held the reins of the emperor's favorite horse, Marengo, while officers moved quietly through the camp, speaking in low voices as if not to disturb the fragile peace of early morning. The emperor studied a large map spread across a wooden table. With his gloved finger, he traced the line of a river, then paused near a village named half-smudged by dirt and ash. His staff waited silently, watching the slightest movement of his hand as though every gesture carried the weight of fate, which, in truth, it often did. Napoleon valued these moments, the stillness before giving orders, when the future was not yet shaped by the chaos of war, but held carefully in the uncertain balance of planning. Behind him, the army slowly awakened. Thousands of men braced themselves for another day that might be their last. Soldiers murmured to each other as they tightened their belts, checked their muskets, or adjusted the worn straps of their backpacks. Some prayed softly, their voices blending with the distant clanging of metal as artillery crews prepared their cannons. Others simply stared at the horizon, lost in their own thoughts, thinking of home, family, and promises they hoped to someday fulfill. There was always a strange mixture of fear and excitement in the air before a battle. For some, the fear was overwhelming. For others, the fight felt like their purpose. But for Napoleon, the battlefield was his stage, his chessboard, and his greatest arena of expression. He stepped forward now, hands clasped behind his back, scanning the mist that hovered near the riverbanks. The world seemed vast and blank, like a canvas waiting for a painter to bring it to life with broad strokes of strategy and movement. Marshal Berthier approached from the left, carrying a bundle of freshly written reports. "Sire," he said quietly, "the enemy is holding position on the eastern ridge. Scouts report increased activity, but no change in formation." Napoleon nodded without turning. "They are waiting for us to make the first move," he murmured. "They assume we will hesitate." His voice held no frustration, only calm understanding. He respected his opponents even as he planned to defeat them. A young officer, perhaps no more than 21, rode up nervously and bowed. He presented a small scroll sealed in wax. Napoleon broke it open, read the brief message, and tucked it away. "So," he said softly, "the Prussians are slower than expected. Good. That gives us more room to maneuver." The officers exchanged glances. They knew that every hour mattered. Every mile gained or lost could determine whether the emperor's plan would unfold flawlessly or collapse under its own daring. By now the sun had begun to rise, pushing aside the last layers of darkness. A pale light spilled across the plain, revealing the shapes of distant trees, rolling fields, and the faint glint of metal armor on the horizon. From this vantage point, Napoleon saw not just terrain but opportunity. Every hill could be a shield, every valley could be a trap, every cluster of trees could hide the movement of a battalion. Turning to his staff, Napoleon finally spoke the words they had all been waiting for. "Gentlemen, we begin in 2 hours. Tell the corps commanders to prepare their men. Artillery will advance to the forward ridge. Cavalry will remain in reserve until I give the signal. No one is to engage prematurely." His orders spread through the camp like ripples of energy. Drums began to beat slow, steady rhythms that echoed across the fields. Flags were raised, catching the early sunlight and announcing the presence of the French army with bold colors. Horses snorted and stamped the dirt as their riders mounted. Cannons creaked into position, their wheels grinding through the soft soil. And through it all, Napoleon walked slowly along the line of infantry, acknowledging each regiment with a nod or a brief word. Men straightened their backs when he passed. Even those who trembled moments before felt a renewed strength, as if the emperor's presence alone filled them with resolve. For Napoleon, this ritual mattered deeply. He knew these soldiers were the heart of his empire. Their steps, their courage, and their sacrifices built the foundations of his victories. The bond between commander and army was something few leaders ever achieved, but Napoleon had mastered it. As the morning brightened, the final preparations came together. The battlefield was almost ready, like a vast theater waiting for the first actors to take their positions. The calmness that had settled over the plain began to tighten, becoming a quiet tension that promised thunder. Napoleon mounted Marengo, adjusted his gloves, and looked once more toward the horizon. "It begins," he whispered, and the world held its breath. The early morning haze had lifted just enough for the French army to be seen in its full silent power. Across the fields, long lines of infantry stood ready, rows of blue coats, white straps, brass buttons, and polished bayonets that glimmered faintly under the pale sunlight. The stillness of the scene gave the impression of statues waiting to come alive, each soldier holding his breath until the emperor's orders would finally set the great mechanism of war into motion. Napoleon rode along the front, his horse moving with steady, rhythmic steps. The officers guiding him made sure to keep a respectful distance, letting the emperor's presence dominate the moment. Every soldier he passed straightened instinctively, their expressions tightening with determination. This ritual was more than a formality. It was a silent conversation between leader and army, an exchange of trust built through years of campaigns. At the far left, troops from the four corps stood behind a line of trees. Their boots, covered in dew, made soft crackling noises as they shifted their weight. One soldier, A veteran with a thick mustache and a scar stretching across his cheek, whispered to the man beside him, "If the emperor rides this way, today will be hard." His companion nodded. "Hard days make great victories," he replied quietly. These small dialogues echoed all across the army, but none of them broke the disciplined order. Everyone knew their position, everyone knew the stakes. And though fear lingered in the corners of their minds, there was a feeling of unity stronger than hesitation. Far behind the infantry lines, the artillery crews had begun their final checks. Cannons stood in symmetrical rows, their iron surfaces cold and still. Powder barrels were stacked carefully nearby, covered with damp cloth to prevent sparks. A captain ran his fingers along the barrel of a 12-pounder, murmuring to himself as he inspected the metal. Artillery required precision, and any small mistake could turn a powerful weapon into a disaster. "Fuse length verified," one crewman called out. "Aiming posts aligned," another answered. Everything had to be perfect, because once the battle opened, these cannons would speak with the voice of thunder, shaping the battle more than any line of muskets could. Behind this organized machinery of war stood the cavalry, perhaps the most restless of all. Horses pawed at the ground, blowing clouds of warm air into the cold morning. The riders sat tall in their saddles, holding their reins firmly yet lightly. Some young dragoons whispered to calm their mounts, while experienced horsemen simply looked ahead, their expressions unreadable. The cavalry lived for movement and speed. Waiting like this was always the hardest part. Meanwhile, on a slight rise overlooking the entire field, Napoleon finally halted. He dismounted, letting one of his aides take Marengo's reins. The emperor positioned himself where he could see the distant enemy formations, dark shapes moving slowly on the opposite ridge, adjusting their lines just as the French were doing. The Allied forces, a mixture of hardened units drawn from different nations, were preparing as well. Their banners fluttered weakly in the morning breeze, creating a mosaic of colors that contrasted sharply with the grayish sky. Marshal Berthier approached again, carrying a new set of reports. "Sire, the right flank is secured. Marshal Ney is in position." Napoleon nodded but did not speak at first. His gaze drifted across the plain, studying the folds in the land, the curvature of the hills, the shape of the small river that cut the field almost exactly in half. He imagined the movement of battalions across this terrain, how they would advance, wheeling in perfect formation, how the cavalry might strike at a crucial moment, how the artillery would reshape the rhythm of the battle with each thunderous volley. To others, it looked like a silent pause. But in Napoleon's mind, the entire battle had already begun. "Tell Ney," Napoleon said finally, "to hold his fire until he sees their infantry descend the ridge. We will draw them in deeper than they expect." Berthier bowed. "Yes, sire." General Soult stepped forward next. "Your Majesty, scouts report the enemy cavalry is massing near the center. They may attempt to break through early." Napoleon allowed a faint smile. "Let them come. They are too eager today. They will find us ready." With every passing moment, the army seemed to inhale more tension, like iron being heated before it bends. Drummers began marching slowly through the ranks, their steady rhythms echoing over the fields. Flags were unfurled, their bright colors lifting the spirit of the men who looked upon them. Officers checked their pocket watches, counting down to the moment when the emperor would give the signal that would unleash 60,000 men across the plain. The sun finally climbed above the hills, lighting the battlefield with a soft, golden glow. The dew evaporated into thin mist, curling around the boots of soldiers like pale smoke. From the other ridge, faint movement could be seen as the enemy completed their own final preparations. Somewhere across the distance, a single trumpet sounded, a long, drawn-out note that hung in the cold air like a warning. Napoleon looked toward that direction but remained still. "They are impatient," he said to the officers beside him. "We will not match their haste. We will control the pace of this battle, not them." The officers nodded, understanding perfectly. This patience, this careful timing, was part of what made Napoleon's command style different from most generals. He fought not with emotion, but with calculation. Even when his enemies moved aggressively, he responded on his own terms.